calm criminal.
There are crimes that feel reckless. There are crimes that feel greedy. And then there are crimes that feel ideological. The kind where the damage isn't just measured in money or blood, but in memory. Where something abstract, authority, continuity, belief, is taken apart piece by piece and repurposed into something smaller, something easier to spend. That's what happened to the English crown jewels in the middle of the 17th century. Not stolen by a thief in the night, not smuggled out beneath a cloak, but dismantled openly, legally, with paperwork. And somehow that makes it worse. By the time Oliver Cromwell ordered the destruction of the crown jewels, England had already learned how fragile kings really were. The illusion had cracked. And once that happens, it's very hard to convince people that gold and gemstones can glue it back together. The story begins, as so many English tragedies do, with a king who believed he was chosen. Charles I inherited the throne in 1625, along with a dangerous certainty that his authority came directly from God, and that questioning it was not merely disloyal, but sinful. This was not a useful belief to hold in a country increasingly interested in questioning things. Charles believed in order, in hierarchy, in ceremony. He adored art, symbolism, ritual. He collected paintings the way other men collected allies. He understood how objects could project power. Crowns, sceptres, robes. And he leaned into that language heavily. The crown jewels mattered deeply to him. At coronation, he wore St. Edward's crown, that heavy circlet of solid gold, whose very weight was meant to remind the wearer that authority was a burden as much as a privilege. The arches rose stiffly over his head, meeting beneath a cross. God above king, king above people, people beneath both. He held the sceptre, gold, jewelled, commanding, and the orb, the world rendered small and obedient beneath Christian rule. The message was clear, and increasingly it was unwelcome. England fractured along lines that had been quietly forming for decades. Parliament versus Crown, Protestant versus Protestant, authority versus consent. The English Civil War was not a neat conflict. It was personal. Families split. Towns changed hands. Loyalty became something you could lose simply by standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. By the 1640s, the war was no longer about negotiation. It was about removal. Charles was captured, tried, and in January 1649, something happened that had been unthinkable for centuries. A reigning king was sentenced to death. The execution took place outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. It was cold. The crowd was silent in that unnerving way. Crowds sometimes go quiet when they realize history is about to do something irreversible. Charles wore 2 shirts, reportedly, so that no one would mistake shivering for fear. When the axe fell, it didn't just end a life. It ended a concept. And suddenly, the crown jewels were dangerous. Because what are crowns for when there is no crown? What use is a sceptre when there is no hand permitted to hold it? To the new Commonwealth government, the jewels weren't heritage, they weren't art, they weren't sacred, they were propaganda. Worse, they were potential propaganda. As long as the regalia existed, the monarchy could be imagined back into being. Objects have a way of doing that. They linger, they wait. They remind people what once was and what could be again. Cromwell understood this instinctively, so he did something Thomas Blood would later do with a hammer. Only with authority instead of force. He ordered them destroyed, not hidden, not locked away, not buried, destroyed. Inventories were drawn up, each object described clinically, almost tenderly, before being condemned. The crown, valued not for what it meant, but for how much gold it contained. The sceptre, stripped of jewels. The orb, dismantled. Stones were prized out. Gold was melted down. Sacred geometry became bullion. Divine right was reduced to coinage. It's hard not to imagine the sound of it. The hiss of molten gold, the clatter of gemstones dropped into trays, the silence where reverence used to be. These objects had survived medieval wars, dynastic collapses, even accidental loss to the sea, but they could not survive being deemed unnecessary. The irony is sharp enough to cut. The crown jewels were not stolen by enemies. They were not looted by invaders. They were erased by their own country in the name of moral clarity. And for a moment, a brief, astonishing moment, England existed without them. No crown waiting in the tower, no orb representing dominion, no sceptre to point with authority. Just a nation attempting to govern itself without theatre. It didn't last, and that perhaps is the most revealing part of all. Cromwell liked plain rooms. That sounds trivial, but it isn't. He distrusted ornament in the way some people distrust charm, as though decoration itself were a kind of a lie. Paintings made him uneasy. Ceremony irritated him. Anything that suggested hierarchy beyond usefulness felt suspiciously Catholic, even when it wasn't. And the crown jewels were hierarchy made visible. They were not subtle. They didn't whisper authority. They announced it. Gold arranged into shapes that said, "This person matters more than you." Gemstones positioned to imply divine approval. Objects designed to be seen from a distance and understood instantly. Cromwell did not want England to look governed. He wanted it to be governed by rules, by godliness, by discipline. The problem was that England had spent centuries learning to believe in power by seeing it. So the jewels had to go. The process was bureaucratic, which somehow makes it more chilling. Committees were formed, lists were drawn, Each piece was recorded in inventories with a precision that bordered on affection, not because they loved the objects, but because they wanted to know exactly what they were destroying. The crown most people imagine today, St. Edward's crown, did not survive this moment. The medieval original, believed to have been associated with Edward the Confessor himself, was melted down entirely. There is something almost obscene about that. A crown thought to carry sacred lineage reduced to molten gold and poured into ingots. Those ingots were then struck into coins. The head of the king replaced by numbers. Authority flattened. The sceptres were dismantled next. These were long objects, awkward to melt whole, so they were taken apart. Jewels removed first, diamonds, rubies, sapphires. Each stone suddenly stripped of meaning, becoming merely valuable rather than significant. Stones don't care where they sit. That's one of their more unsettling qualities. They were sold, reset, dispersed. Some likely ended up in private collections across Europe, glinting quietly in rings or pendants, their former lives forgotten. A jewel that once symbolized dominion might later have adorned a merchant's wife or been traded again and again until its origin dissolved completely. The orb didn't fare much better. Its meaning, the world under God, was precisely the sort of visual theology Cromwell despised. The gold was melted, the cross discarded. The circle that once claimed universality became nothing more than raw material. What strikes me every time I return to this story is how methodical it all was. No rage, no smashing, no theatrics, just administration. And perhaps that's the most unsettling thing of all. Because when Thomas Blood later attacks the jewels with a mallet, it felt shocking, violent, transgressive. You can condemn a man with a hammer easily. History likes its villains obvious, but Cromwell didn't need a hammer. He had legitimacy, and legitimacy is far more efficient. The Tower of London, once the keeper of these objects, became merely a storage facility for their remnants. Where crowns had once been guarded, bullion now waited to be moved. Where reverence had lingered, accounting took over. For 11 years, England existed without a crown. That alone feels strange to say. No coronations, no regalia, no ritual gestures binding ruler to past. Cromwell ruled not as king, but as Lord Protector. A title that sounds modest until you realise it came with armies, prisons, and the power to reshape a nation's identity. And yet, despite all of this, something lingered. You can destroy objects, but you can't so easily destroy expectation. People remembered what a coronation looked like. They remembered the weight of ceremony, the way crowns turned flesh and blood men into something other. The absence of the jewels did not erase monarchy from the imagination. It preserved it like a negative space. When Cromwell died in 1658, the system he'd built began to wobble almost immediately. His son lacked authority. The army lost patience. Parliament grew tired of pretending that solemnity alone could replace tradition. And so, Quietly at first, then very quickly, England decided it wanted its crown back. Charles II returned in 1660, and with him came an extraordinary problem. There were no crown jewels, none. Nothing to place on his head, nothing to put in his hands. No visible way to tell the story England needed to tell. That the monarchy had returned unchanged, as though the last decade had been an unfortunate interruption rather than a fundamental rupture. So England did what it does best. It pretended. New crown jewels were commissioned. Gold was gathered. Jewellers worked feverishly, recreating the old forms from memory, description, and political necessity. The new St. Edward's crown was made deliberately heavy, deliberately archaic in style, as though weight itself could imply antiquity. Continuity was performed, and most people accepted it. That's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this story. Symbolism doesn't need authenticity to work. It only needs agreement. The crown jewels you see today, gleaming behind glass, are not medieval survivors. They are restorations, reconstructions, carefully designed echoes of something that no longer exists. Which means that when we talk about the crown jewels being stolen later, or threatened, or protected, we're already talking about replacements, ghosts wearing gold. And I can't help wondering whether Cromwell understood that better than anyone else, that by destroying the originals, he forced the monarchy to admit, even briefly, that its power had always depended on belief rather than metal. He tried to break the spell. It just didn't stay broken. The thing about recreating sacred objects is that you're never just making jewellery. You're making excuses. After the Restoration, England didn't simply need crowns and sceptres. It needed a story that allowed everyone to look forward, without staring too hard at what had just happened. The monarchy had been abolished. A king had been executed. The old regalia had been melted down and sold like scrap. None of that sat comfortably with the idea of an ancient, uninterrupted line of authority. So the solution was elegance. If the new crown jewels looked old enough, heavy enough, inevitable enough, then perhaps history itself would feel persuaded to cooperate. Goldsmiths were commissioned at speed. Designs were pulled from descriptions, paintings, half-remembered ceremonies. There was no surviving blueprint, only expectation. And expectation, when mixed with money and urgency, tends to produce exaggeration. That's why the recreated St. Edward's crown is so astonishingly heavy. Over 2 kilograms of solid gold. Heavier than its medieval predecessor likely ever was. The arches are thick, the band dense, the cross assertive. It feels less like a practical crown and more like a declaration. This has always been here. Which is, of course, a lie. But it's a very good one. The sceptres were rebuilt with the same intention. Long, commanding, unmistakable. They were designed to photograph well, to be visible from a distance, to feel authoritative even to someone who knew nothing of their history. And perhaps that's the key difference between the old regalia and the new. The medieval jewels evolved slowly. They accumulated meaning over time, acquiring scars, repairs, legends. They felt lived in, the way old buildings do. Uneven, imperfect, undeniably real. The restoration jewels were designed to feel meaningful. They are immaculate in a way that should make us suspicious. What fascinates me, and I suspect always will, is how little this bothers us. We stand in the Tower of London, peer through thick glass, and feel the weight of history without asking which parts of it were reconstructed in a hurry to cover embarrassment. We accept the jewels as ancient not because they are, but because we want them to be. That willingness, that quiet agreement, is what Cromwell tried to interrupt, and failed, because England doesn't actually want a world without ceremony. It wants ceremony it can pretend is timeless. It wants continuity, even if that continuity has been broken, melted down, and reforged. The crown jewels today are not just symbols of monarchy, they are symbols of resilience, not of kings, but of narrative, of the ability to smooth over rupture with enough gold and confidence. Which brings me back, inevitably, to Cromwell himself. He is often framed as a joyless man, a destroyer, a fanatic, and he was all of those things at times. But he was also someone who understood the danger of objects that speak too loudly. He recognized that crowns and sceptres do work even when no one explicitly believes in them. That's why he didn't hide the jewels. He didn't lock them away for safekeeping. He destroyed them, because as long as they existed, they whispered. They whispered of hierarchy, of divine right, of an order older than argument. And Cromwell wanted a nation that argued, with scripture, with law, with conscience, rather than kneeling. He lost that argument in the end, but he did leave a mark. Every time the crown jewels are described as ancient, there is an unspoken asterisk. Every coronation, every televised procession, every slow pan across gold and gemstone carries with it the quiet truth that England once decided none of this was necessary, and then changed its mind. I find that endlessly compelling, not because it diminishes the jewels, but because it humanizes them. They are not eternal. They are choices, renewed, repaired, restaged. They have been killed once already, which means they can be threatened again. And perhaps that's why stories like Thomas Blood's theft still resonate. Why we're drawn to moments when the spell slips, when someone treats the regalia as objects rather than absolutes. Because deep down, we know that power is never as solid as it looks behind glass. It relies on agreement, on performance, on a collective decision to keep believing. And sometimes, just sometimes, history reminds us how easily belief can be melted down, poured into something else, and spent. The Tower of London has an odd relationship with memory. It presents itself as permanent. Stone thick enough to outlast centuries, walls that seem uninterested in change, but its purpose has shifted constantly. Fortress, palace, prison, execution site, treasury, tourist attraction, each role layered on top of the last, never fully erasing what came before. After Cromwell, the Tower became something else as well. A place of quiet embarrassment. Because once you've destroyed your own regalia, you don't really get to pretend that your symbols are invulnerable ever again. You can rebuild them, polish them, surround them with ritual and guards and glass. But you can't know what you know. You can't forget that England itself once decided the crown jewels were expendable. And that knowledge lingers. It seeps into later anxieties, later precautions, later stories of threat and theft. The obsession with protecting the restored jewels isn't just about Thomas Blood or about modern security concerns. It's about the uncomfortable truth that the greatest danger to monarchy has never come from outside the country. It has always come from within. After the Restoration, the crown jewels were no longer treated as mere ceremonial objects. They became almost talismanic, proof that England had chosen continuity over rupture, that the experiment without a crown had been tried and politely abandoned, which meant they needed watching carefully. The jewels were placed on public display at the Tower, partly to show confidence, partly to reassure the population that the monarchy was tangible again. You could see it. You could point to it. You could reassure yourself that something solid still existed. But public display is an invitation. Cromwell had removed the jewels by decree. Thomas Blood would later try to remove them by nerve. Both approaches exploited the same vulnerability: accessibility. The idea that symbols must be visible in order to function. And here's the part that keeps my interest. The thing I keep circling back to. Cromwell didn't just destroy objects. He forced England to confront the mechanics of belief. When the jewels were gone, nothing supernatural happened. The sun rose, courts met, laws were enforced, people married, died, argued, paid taxes. The absence of crowns did not end the world. And that knowledge is dangerous, because once you realize that authority continues without ceremony, you start to ask whether ceremony was ever essential or merely persuasive. That's not a question monarchies enjoy being asked. So the rebuilt crown jewels had to overcompensate. They had to feel heavier, richer, more emphatic than before. The restored regalia doesn't just suggest authority, it insists on it. Gold, laid on thick. Stones oversized. Design choices that prioritize presence over subtlety. If belief wavers, spectacle can sometimes prop it up. And yet, even with all that effort, the knowledge remains. These objects are not uninterrupted relics. They are reconstructions standing in for something deliberately erased. Which brings us, inevitably, back to Charles I. His execution was not just a political act, it was a symbolic one. A statement that kings could be held accountable, that a divine right was not immune to human judgment. When his head fell, the crown effectively fell with it. Not physically, but conceptually. Cromwell's decision to destroy the regalia was simply the logical next step. You don't keep a crown once you've decided the head beneath it is mortal in the most ordinary sense. What followed, the restoration, the rebuilding, the careful performance of continuity, was an attempt to reverse that realization. To say, quietly, let's not think about that again. But history is uncooperative. It keeps returning to the same fault lines. That's why the story of the crown jewels is never just about theft or protection. It's about anxiety, about the fear that belief might falter again, that someone might look at a crown and see only metal, might look at a sceptre and see only a stick with stones in it. Cromwell did that, and for a while he convinced a nation to do the same. Every guard at the tower, every lock, every reinforced display case exists not because of foreign invaders or criminal masterminds, but because England once discovered that its most powerful symbols could be dismantled by people who stopped believing in them. That's a difficult lesson to unlearn, and perhaps it never truly has been. One of the quieter consequences of Cromwell's decision, and perhaps the most lasting, is how carefully later monarchs learned to perform certainty. After the Restoration, nothing about monarchy could be casual anymore. Casualness had proven dangerous. Familiarity had allowed people to imagine alternatives. So kings and queens became more deliberate, more choreographed, more aware that power had to be seen to be felt. Ceremony stopped being decorative and became defensive. Coronations grew more elaborate, processions more measured. Every gesture slowed, formalized, fossilized almost as it happened. If the crown jewels were no longer ancient in material, then they would become ancient in motion. Repetition would stand in for lineage. The crown would be lifted in the same way. The sceptre passed at the same angle. The orb placed carefully, precisely, as though deviation itself might invite doubt. I find it hard not to see this as a direct response to Cromwell. A nation once shown that authority could exist without symbols now doubled down on symbols to make sure no one noticed. And yet, despite all that effort, the anxiety never really left. The crown jewels are protected today with a level of seriousness that borders on paranoia. Thick glass, alarms, guards who do not smile, procedures that assume the unthinkable is always being planned by someone, somewhere. This isn't just about value, it's about vulnerability. Because the truth, learned the hard way in the 17th century, is that the most effective way to neutralize a symbol is not to steal it, but to redefine it. Cromwell didn't deny the existence of crowns. He denied their necessity. And necessity is where power lives. That's why modern monarchy leans so heavily on continuity, on the idea that this has always been done, that this crown has always rested here, that these stones have always meant this. Because once you start admitting replacements, reconstructions, and deliberate forgetting, the spell weakens. I don't think this is hypocrisy. I think it's survival. Symbols are not lies, but they are agreements. Collective decisions to treat certain objects as more than what they're made of. And agreements only hold as long as people keep renewing them, often without noticing. Cromwell noticed. He noticed that the crown jewels didn't rule anyone, that armies did, that laws did. That belief could be redirected. And for a brief period, England lived inside that knowledge. What followed wasn't a rejection of that insight. It was a containment of it. Ceremony didn't disappear. It thickened, hardened, became ritualized to the point of inevitability. And yet, the knowledge still hums beneath the surface. Every time the crown jewels are discussed as priceless, there's an implicit recognition that their value isn't intrinsic. Gold has a price. Stones have a market. What cannot be priced is agreement. The shared willingness to see meaning rather than material. Cromwell disrupted that agreement, and although monarchy returned, it returned with a quiet awareness of just how easily the ground beneath it can shift. I think that's why the crown jewels feel so careful. They are not displayed casually. They are not treated playfully. They are never quite allowed to relax into mere beauty. Everything about them says, do not touch, do not question, do not imagine alternatives. Because alternatives have existed. They have been tried. They worked. At least for a while. And that knowledge is still there, pressed into the gold like a fingerprint that never quite comes out. When people talk about the theft of the crown jewels, they tend to focus on spectacle, on daring, on audacity, on thieves with nerve and disguises and hammers. But the most successful theft was quieter. It happened with votes and inventories and furnaces, with men who believed they were doing the right thing, with a nation that agreed, briefly, to live without a crown. That's the theft that still matters, because unlike gold, belief doesn't melt cleanly. It leaves residue. It clings. It resurfaces when least convenient. And every time the crown jewels catch the light, gleaming behind glass, I can't help thinking that what we're really looking at isn't power preserved, but power rehearsed, again and again, carefully, hopeful that repetition might finally make it feel permanent. There's a peculiar stillness inside the jewel house. Not silence. There's always movement, always the low murmur of visitors, the shuffle of shoes, the faint hum of security systems doing their quiet work, but a stillness of intention. Everything in that space is designed to slow you down, to make you look longer than you planned to encourage a kind of reverent hesitation. I've stood there before, watching people's expressions change. They arrive curious, mildly interested, and then something shifts. Not awe exactly, awe is too dramatic, but recognition, a sense that they're looking at something that expects agreement from them. The crown jewels do not ask what you think. They assume, and that assumption is their real power, which is why Cromwell's act still feels so unsettling, centuries later. He didn't just remove objects, He interrupted that assumption. He created a moment in English history where the question, "Do we need this?" was not only asked, but answered. And the answer, briefly, was no. That answer didn't last, but it existed, and once an idea exists, it never quite goes away. Today, the crown jewels are presented as inevitabilities, as though they have always been there and always will be. Their story is smoothed, edited, arranged into something palatable. The melted crowns become lost. The sold jewels become dispersed. The uncomfortable decade without monarchy becomes a regrettable pause rather than a genuine alternative. We're very good at that, turning ruptures into footnotes. But Cromwell's theft wasn't a footnote, it was a declaration, a statement that symbols only function when people consent to their meaning, that a crown without belief is just an inconveniently shaped piece of metal. And that knowledge still hums beneath the glass. You can feel it in the way the jewels are guarded, in the way their history is explained carefully, selectively, in the way modern ceremony leans so heavily on repetition, as though consistency itself might be persuasive. Every coronation is, in some sense, a reassurance. A reassurance that the spell still works. What fascinates me most is not that the crown jewels survived Cromwell. They didn't. But that they were rebuilt so quickly, so confidently, and so completely. That England chose spectacle over uncertainty. Continuity over honesty. Not because honesty was unbearable, but because continuity was easier. I don't say that cynically. I say it with a kind of reluctant admiration. Nations, like people, need stories that allow them to sleep at night. Stories where breaks can be repaired, where mistakes can be smoothed over with enough golden ceremony. The crown jewels are one of those stories. They are not ancient in the way we like to imagine. They are not uninterrupted. They are not invulnerable. They have been drowned, melted, sold, reconstructed, dented, broken, and reassembled, sometimes by enemies, sometimes by the country they represent. And yet they persist, not because they are indestructible, but because we keep agreeing to see them as more than objects. That's the fragile thing in the Tower of London. Not the gold, not the stones, not even the crowns themselves. It's the agreement. Cromwell broke it once, briefly, deliberately, and England rushed to repair it as soon as it could, which leaves us with a quiet, lingering question, one that never quite gets asked out loud, but never entirely goes away either. If belief made the crown jewels powerful, and belief once took that power away, what exactly is holding it together now? And how much of it depends on us continuing not to ask?